The deficit and the debt in general, it's being framed as a spending problem. You know, we're being told that we're spending beyond our means, that this isn't reasonable, that we need to get our house in order. But what isn't being talked about is the fact that, you know, personal income taxes haven't cut significantly in the last 4 or 5 years. So what we really have is a revenue problem. What we have is no income coming into the household. And rather than cutting services for New Brunswickers who need them, I mean, things like taking snowplows off the roads that ambulances need to travel and so on, this is outrageous. What we need to have is a restoration of those tax levels, because we could handle them before, and if we, you know, invest in things collectively, we're going to have more services to take care of us in the long run. Certainly, I mean, New Brunswick has one of, if not the lowest corporate tax rate, the lowest corporate tax rate in the country, lower than Alberta. That's brutal. There's definitely the feeling that corporations, when they come and invest in New Brunswick, that they're bringing good jobs with them and so on. But if they're going to take advantage of not only our natural resources, but our human resources, you know, they need to contribute as well, because the reason that they can have those employees is that those employees are covered under provincial health. The trucks for those companies travel on provincial roads. If companies came in and paved their own highways and paid the health care for their own workers, you know, maybe then it would be reasonable to expect that there wouldn't be a corporate income tax, but that's not the case. We do provide services for all of the people in New Brunswick, so corporations should have to pay into that as well if they're taking advantage of it.
I'm wondering about whether there is in fact a deficit, and the reason that I wonder that is because I feel that the way that taxes are collected is not equitable, and I would imagine that a lot of our deficit problem could be solved if there was an equitable collection of taxes. And if we eliminated some things, there's some things we could truly eliminate. For example, tax havens and tax shelters. Corporate welfare comes to mind as well. You know, subsidizing corporate entities that really do not require any subsidization at all. And where does it come from? I mean, the public purse is pillaged, and then when it appears there's no money, that all-important cash cow, the social safety net, is gutted. That's what's sacrificed. And not only is that sacrificed, but then the inheritance that we all have of natural capital is also on the chopping block as well. So in order to make up this so-called shortfall, we're selling the farm, literally. I have heard over and over again that one of our deficit-solving problems would be to just restore those levels of taxation. No, that's a lot of money. That's where's it gone? Why not bring it back into the public coffers and then redistribute that? So we rebuild the social safety net, we actually put money back into communities, and we start solving some pretty fundamental problems, like, for example, why is poverty so high in this province? There really is no excuse for that in a country like Canada, one of the wealthiest nations on the planet. We simply should not have the levels of family poverty and especially child poverty. Shouldn't happen.
So I'm an economist at the University of New Brunswick, and I've been studying the financial situation of the province for quite some time. I first got interested in this in 2008 when there were unprecedented tax cuts given to individuals and to corporations. Those tax cuts, of course, who benefited from them? Mostly it was the rich. For example, if you take someone who has an income of $20,000, how much did they benefit from the tax cuts? About $500. Take someone who has an income 5 times greater, how much did they benefit? By 15 times as much. So these tax cuts were regressive, and they put the budget into a deficit situation. Now, the tax cuts weren't the only thing that happened in 2008, of course. The other thing was that the world went into a huge recession. So as a result, the province had unprecedented deficits. We were running deficits of nearly $1 billion a year. Last year, our deficit increased by 10%. The interest on the debt is now the 4th biggest expenditure. It increased last year by some tens of millions of dollars. So the question is, how much of the situation is caused by the worldwide recession and how much is caused by the tax cuts. Very little of the deficit was caused by the worldwide recession. Most of it was caused by the tax cuts. And therefore, the deficit problem could be easily solved by reversing those unfair, regressive, and ineffective tax cuts and going back to tax rates that we had in 2008. This would balance the budget in a flash. I mentioned that the deficit is the fourth largest expenditure. Another way to get a handle on the seriousness of the situation is that the interest on the debt absorbs 50 cents of every dollar we spend in income taxes. The tax cuts, more information on those. What were they? They were to individuals, mostly to the rich, also to the corporations. The corporate income tax got cut from 12% to 8%. The large corporation capital tax got abolished. That cost us another $50 million a year. So these tax cuts have been described as unsustainable, ineffective, and regressive. The regressive part of that trilogy, that unholy trilogy, means that it is unfair. The rich are the ones that are primarily benefiting. The rich benefit, the finances go into debt, and then we have to cut back on public services, and the poor are hurt. So that's regressive. Ineffective? They're ineffective because the reason for these tax cuts was to stimulate growth. That's laughable. Literally, the idea was proposed by Arthur Laffer back in the 1980s. He proposed his Laffer curve, and the idea has since, and still is, completely laughable. There is no evidence to suggest that low taxes stimulate growth. No experience, no theory. It's simply pie in the sky ideology propounded by those who stand to benefit from the belief in such nonsense. The final element in this unholy trilogy is unsustainable. Why are they unsustainable? Because they shift the government's budget into a structural deficit position. Now, how do you get out of a structural deficit position? I suppose there's several ways. The obvious way is to reverse the tax cuts. The other way, you might hope, is to stimulate growth. Well, we've just said that's laughable. But there's another reason why it's impossible, and that's because there's a fail-safe device built in to the very structure of the Canadian economy through equalization payments. The people that designed equalization payments designed it in such a way as to prevent one province cutting taxes and growing at the expense of its neighbours. If it tries to do that, equalization payments fall dollar for the increase in the size of the tax base. So you can't grow your way out of it. There is another alternative, which is to cut your public services, which seems to be the method that is primarily being attempted under the current David Allwood government, although there is the possibility that there's so much fat in the system, apparently, that we can make cuts that actually won't hurt public services. That's yet to be seen. The final option, of course, is that it creates a crisis, and in that crisis atmosphere, the government is desperate for any new source of revenue. And as a result, shale gas becomes the promised land. Shale gas, actually natural resource revenues, don't have the problem that other revenues have that I described with equalization payments. They're outside of equalization payments, making them even more attractive as a way to try and balance the province's books. So, my recommendation is that you don't look at the shale gas problem in a situation of emergency, of crisis, where you're desperate to try and balance the books. Rather, you balance the books by correcting the root cause of the unbalance, by correcting what caused them to be unbalanced in the first place. You restore the tax rates to how they were in 2008 when the province's books were balanced and sustainable. That's my message.